Good evening, I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Welcome to the very first edition of Uncensored, our brand new show here on 6 News, where we go in depth with a key newsmaker about the issues that matter to them and matter to you. There's no editing, no shouting and no debates. Our reporters, and that includes myself, aren't here to argue or disagree with the people we're speaking to. We're here to ask them the tough questions, no matter their political views. We also want to hear from you, the viewer, so join the conversation by using hashtag 6newsau in the comments or on social media, or you can email your feedback to us as well, contact@6newsau.com. That's enough about us, so let's get on to our guest, who probably needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He is a heavy critic of the Murdoch media empire, fluent in Mandarin, and is also the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. I spoke to him earlier from the newsroom. Kevin Rudd, welcome to 6 News.
Leonardo, good to be with you.
Very good to speak with you. Now, I'd just like to start by asking, why is your focus on the Murdoch media empire? We know Nine, for example, they own lots of radio, TV stations, newspapers and many websites. Should there be an inquiry into them too?
Well, if you look carefully at the terms of reference to our proposed Royal Commission, it covers the full gamut of media diversity across traditional media platforms, as well as the new social media platforms and the technological challenges arising from convergence. But why Murdoch in particular? It's simply a matter of size. When Murdoch owns 70% of the Australian print readership, now owns Sky Television, is now broadcasting through Sky on the commercial television networks across regional Australia, and already has the single biggest YouTube channel of all the existing news organisations. I say we have a problem. Too much power in one person's hands.
Are there any particular elements of News Corp you're concerned about, be that Sky News, The Australian, the capital city papers, Foxtel, or is it just in general?
Well, I'm an opponent of monopoly, and this guy comes as close to a media monopoly in Australia as anyone would get. Very few Australians are aware of the fact that of all the advanced democracies, we have the highest concentration of media ownership anywhere in the world. This is not normal, having so much power vested in one media baron's hands. So that is my problem. When you look, for example, at what Murdoch does in his print platforms, Daily Telegraph, Melbourne Herald Sun, Brisbane Courier Mail, Adelaide Advertiser, Hobart Mercury, just to name a few, and the so-called national daily, The Australian, it then bleeds through in its content into the rest of the electronic platforms and the social media platforms. So these are not free and independent, freely standing parts of the Murdoch media empire. They frankly cross-pollinate and take that one man's influence a huge step further.
I think you touched on at the start there the rise of Sky News' YouTube channel, which has shot up by hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million subscribers in the space of around 2 years, especially around the US election last year. What do you make of that?
Well, I've lived in the United States for the better part of the last 6 or 7 years. I run an American think tank in New York. And so I've had to consume Murdoch's product through Fox television. And I've seen what Fox has done to American politics in recent times, which is to create two warring tribes. That is so-called liberals, which in American English refers to people broadly on the centre left, and conservatives, which Murdoch's Fox television has pushed further and further to the far right. And when I see Fox becoming the ecosystem, the echo chamber in which increasingly far-right views, be they on anti-vaccine, be they on Trump being a miracle worker, being they on debunking the climate science. And when I see all those views being echoed back in even stronger form from the far-right ecosystems they create, frankly, it's the prototype of what Murdoch is now doing through Sky Television in Australia. Started the same way, syndicated through regional television networks, a big social media platform through YouTube. The result is we end up with an Australian set of warring tribes and polarised to one extreme and the other, and then as a consequence rendering the country ultimately much less governable.
Well, moving away from the fact, obviously, Murdoch is bigger than any other company, as you say, monopoly. Do you think any other networks or outlets here in Australia have that same kind of partisan problem, in your words, to be, pro-Trump like this, or just pro-anyone? Is Sky and the Newscorp papers just the main partisan outlet?
Well, Leonardo, there's always a good test here, which is what do the media organisations do in terms of their formal endorsements or opposition for a political party going into an election? Now, for 21 of the last 21 federal and state elections over the last 10 years, we've had the Murdoch media empire viciously endorse one side of Australian politics and viciously attack the other, and no guesses as to how that's turned out in terms of which parties we're talking about. Now, you can say that a newspaper outfit or a media organisation might back one side of politics for 2 or 3 elections in a row and then go to the other side. But this has now become a de facto arm of the Conservative coalition. The coalition government of Australia is the Murdoch Party and the Liberal Party, and if you like, the National Party, making it a 3-way split. And so that is the problem. When I look at the other media platforms, whether it's Nine would be, I think, an unapologetically centre-right media organisation. When I look at The Guardian, probably centre to centre-left. When I look at the ABC, probably the centre. And when you look at 7 and 10, separate questions, one perhaps more conservative than the other. The bottom line is there's nothing like the sheer campaigning momentum of a Murdoch media beast effectively acting as a political protection racket for one side of politics only. And that's bad for the democracy.
I think everyone knows the main Murdoch outlets here: the Australian, Sky News, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun. What are some of the maybe smaller outlets or websites that are owned by Murdoch that you think less people might actually know about?
Well, here in Queensland, where I come from, it's quite a challenge, as you know, winning a federal election without winning a sizable slice of the seats in my own home state. And to win seats in Queensland, you can't just win them in Brisbane because of the demography of the state. 1/3 of people live in the capital city, 1/3 live in wider southeast Queensland, and the other third live in the regional centres up and down the Queensland coast. It's different to New South Wales, it's different to Victoria, and certainly different to Adelaide and Perth in terms of the non-capital city concentration. So here in Queensland, if you were to go through who has owned the media mastheads up and down the coast, these have been wall-to-wall Murdoch until he closed a number of them and put them online. Cairns Post, Murdoch. Townsville Bulletin, Murdoch. Mackay Mercury, what's left of it, Murdoch. Gladstone Observer, Murdoch. Rockhampton Morning Bulletin, Murdoch. Sunshine Coast Daily, Murdoch. Gold Coast Bulletin, Murdoch. I can go on if you'd like. So in each of these areas, it becomes, as it were, the filtering of news through an ideological lens for those local communities. Reinforce them when they sit down in front of the telly of an evening to watch what is often the only television content available, free to air, during the day and in the evening, and that is Sky News, rebroadcast through Win and Prime regional television networks.
Yeah, well, we should point out it's not Prime, it's Southern Cross Austereo that it's rebroadcast through. What do you make of that, the expansion into regional free-to-air, the expansion Sky's done there?
Well, the deal as of 1 August, in terms of the rebroadcast through regional television, enables all that Sky After Dark content to be rebroadcast through these 2 quite extensive regional networks. In other words, you don't have to just tune into Sky Television as a subscriber. You don't have to watch YouTube to get your content. You've got it staring at you through your own regional free-to-air broadcast networks. And this means that you're going to have this single message about anti-vax, about skepticism about the science underpinning the pandemic, about the promotion of a whole series of bogus cures for COVID across the country, as well as questioning the necessity for quarantine, questioning the necessity for lockdown when you've got a major outbreak, together with the rest of the ideological agenda, still questioning to this day the underpinning science of climate change. It gets hammered at you by what you read and what you see and what you hear through multiple media every day. That's what I call propaganda. And the Murdoch media beast is frankly a propaganda outfit acting on behalf of the conservative side of Australian politics and taking them in a more and more right-wing direction.
Yeah, well, during the Senate inquiry into media diversity several weeks ago, you claimed that the arrangement Sky did with the regional broadcasters broadened considerably when they relaunched Sky News on Win as Sky News Regional. But yeah, in doing so, they actually lost markets, including regional WA, Mildura, and the entire state of Tasmania on free-to-air television. Do you accept that claim was false, as some have said?
You know something? Right across Australia, you're going to have different reactions to what Murdoch is doing. But I can say to you, when I run into people in the street and they come from either Dubbo or they come from Gympie in Queensland, Dubbo, New South Wales, it's quite remarkable when you begin to hear the same propaganda messages from Alan Jones or Bolt be repeated to you. In volume and intensity and frankly in repetition. So yes, there'll be swings and roundabouts across the country, we understand that. But when Murdoch rolled out Fox through similar arrangements in the United States, it was not a universal take-up, but frankly the strategic trend was clear and the impact over time was equally clear. Do you think it's possible, for example, that we could have had the mobilization of far right-wing nutjobs to Washington on the 6th of January to attend Trump's freedom rally to seek to overturn the outcome of the presidential election and then storm the United States Capitol in the absence of the Fox News platform? No, they were all watching it. You could see by the Trump flags, which were being carried into the Capitol building. So the mobilizing impact of these platforms is formidable.
Well, do you reckon we could see our own January 6th moment, be that at the federal parliament or a state parliament, namely in Victoria, with the kind of content Sky After Dark is pushing?
Well, my concern, Leonardo, is this. It is not an overnight development. It happens over many months and certainly years, that what Murdoch does quite deliberately is change the parameters of the permissible boundaries of national debate and discussion, both in the subjects allowed to be discussed and debated and in the views able to be aired within those subjects. That's what they are doing through print and now, of course, through social media and now, of course, through the rebroadcast on free-to-air by courtesy of Sky. And add to that the extra barrel of cash they now get from the digital media bargaining code brought to them courtesy of the Morrison government, which essentially means that every time a piece of content is used, which comes originally from News Corporation on anything on social media, you can hear the cha-ching in the accounting houses of the Murdoch media operation around the world. So when you put all that together, it has a pervasive effect. That's why I keep going back to this call for a royal commission. Australians need to sit back, look at the evidence and understand how this monopoly is unfolding and its impact on the parameters for the national debate that we are having at present, and take warning signs from abroad, like in the United States, where you start to have mobilized these far right-wing activist groups, which from time to time have already taken to the streets in Australia, waving Trump flags and the rest. In my entire adult life, I've never seen a public rally in Australia where a bunch of people committed to an ideological cause start waving around the campaign paraphernalia of a US president. That is what Murdoch is doing, creating this far-right constituency. And over time, heaven knows what the result will be. Look what happened to Darren Chester recently from the National Party. He walks out of the party room saying the far right are taking over his branches and his party. Look, for example, at statements by various LNP members in Queensland who say when they go to branch meetings, it's like running into a meeting which has just been addressed by Andrew Bolt and Alan Jones. That's the pervasive and pernicious effect it has over a period of time.
Well, there's no doubting Sky's After Dark hosts are conservative, but are they all necessarily pro LNP? When we've had Paul Murray, who's been criticising Liberal Premier Stephen Marshall, we've got Alan Jones, who's been relentlessly criticising Gladys Berejiklian in recent times. Are they going further to the right, or what do you make of that?
Well, the bottom line is there is a very clear Murdoch political and ideological agenda. He does not tolerate state or federal Labor governments. He wants to do everything possible to prevent them from being elected. And if they are elected, to do everything to remove them from office. As I said, it is not a mathematical coincidence that for 21 out of the last 21 federal and state elections, the bloke who owns 70% of Australian print readership has campaigned viciously for one side of politics against the other. What you'll see, though, because they're a clever operation, is that tactically from time to time, they'll say something positive about a leading Labor politician here, something critical about a Conservative government. In the case of Berejiklian's government, the attack has been because they perceive they are too far to the left as a Conservative party. But this is all a tactical play against the overall mission, which is to make sure you have a malleable Conservative government in office, prepared to do the political, ideological, and where necessary, commercial bidding of Murdoch's media interests.
Look, taking away the opinion writers in the newspapers, the opinion hosts on Sky, do you personally trust reporting from News Corp journalists?
Individual reporters, by and large, in my experience, seek to do a reasonable job. Where the bias is injected is at the editorial level, when reporters and journalists are sent out to do a number on somebody, or having had this copy produced and sent to the editors and sub-editors, that then they find their copy rewritten altogether, and often a headline with completely the reverse meaning put across the top of it. So the bias actually occurs at the editorial level. When you look at Murdoch's editors across Australia, led by Chris Daw, the editor of The Australian, when you look at Ben English, the editor of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, a guy called Chris Jones, who's the editor of the Courier Mail in Brisbane, all these people are just the willing henchmen of Murdoch's ideological and political interests. So when they get a news story which has been produced by a reporter, they will then do their darndest by giving instructions to the sub-editors to make sure that that content is as skewed as possible in achieving their overall ideological message, which is protection racket for the Conservatives and a vicious set of, shall I say, character assassination exercises against individual Labor leaders and Green Party leaders as well. Knowing a number of these journalists, as I've got to know them over the years, whereas some will have drunk the editorial Kool-Aid because they aspire to be editors themselves, a large number, frankly, are simply trying to do a job. And remember this, the bottom line is, in a competitive and at one level shrinking media market in Australia, there are a limited number of professional opportunities. Murdoch is the single largest employer apart from the ABC. And for those reasons, therefore, these journalists are unlikely to be wanting to rock the boat too much.
Look, some supporters of your campaign for more media diversity and a Royal Commission, they want outlets like Sky News actually taken off the air by regulators and forcibly shut down. Do you support that?
My passionate belief is in media diversity and media freedom. But that actually means that you need to have a diversity of media ownership. So no, I'm not in the business of going beyond what is Australian customary law in ensuring that a non-defamatory news and news which doesn't offend any other law of Australia can be produced, whatever its ideological predilection might be. I'm just saying the health of the democracy depends on diversity. We don't have it anymore. Too much power in one bloke's hands. And he's a foreigner. He's an American and wants to tell this country what to do. I think Australians are pretty jack of that.
Can I ask why you didn't do anything about Murdoch Media when you were PM? I mean, Rupert Murdoch even endorsed you personally during the 2007 election campaign. Do you regret not doing anything then?
With respect, we did a couple of things which are quite significant. The first is, if you go to the 2007 election campaign, Murdoch by that stage had effectively campaigned for the Conservatives under John Howard for quite a number of successive elections. But the overall news coverage split on the part of News Corporation in those days was more in the vicinity of 70-30 against Labor, on a good day 60-40 against Labor. In other words, there was something for us to work with. My objective as the leader of the alternative government of Australia in 2007 was to get that as close to 50-50 as possible. And frankly, anyone in my position would have done exactly the same. How did it turn out in the end? We probably had a campaign which was 60-40 against us, maybe 55-45. Don't read too much into what they finally say on the day before the election. But what you need to look at is what they do in the previous period of time. And in my case, 2007 election, there were a series of massive character attacks on me personally and my family, which John Howard never went through, which Peter Costello never went through, or frankly, any other Conservative political leader has ever gone through. Second point is this. By the time we get to 2011, 2012, our government then launched the Finkelstein inquiry into media diversity in Australia. And this resulted in enormous reactions from the Murdoch stable. And as soon as we lost the election at the end of 2013, all those Finkelstein recommendations were left to rot on the vine. But the final point I'd say is this, Leonardo, is that if you look at the whole spread of the period of the decade, what was once a 60-40 balance or bias proposition against the Labor Party, which was News Corporation in 2007, has now turned into 100-0, or on a very good day, 95-5, in favour of one side of politics, that is the Conservatives, against the progressive alternative. That's where we get to, frankly, a rot in the democracy itself. So the problem has evolved in the period since I was first elected.
Well, look, obviously we had a Liberal government for quite a while before you were first elected. You mentioned the 70-30 on a good day, 60-40 ratio then. Why do you think it, in your opinion, is more now under a Liberal government than it was previously under a Liberal government?
Because I think Murdoch has become progressively more far-right and conservative himself. His son, Lachlan Murdoch, who calls a lot of the shots in Australia, is even more conservative than Rupert Murdoch. Lachlan Murdoch is a deep disbeliever in the science on climate change, for example, whatever the Murdoch mastheads may now say for politically opportunistic reasons in their so-called support for carbon neutrality by 2050. And so with the passing of the baton increasingly to Lachlan Murdoch, you have a doubling down in terms of the conservative agenda. Secondly, we've seen that in terms of Murdoch deciding to jump wholly and solely onto the Trump far-right Republican bandwagon. If there was no Murdoch in America, there would have been no Trump presidency. It became Trump's platform. So this is an evolution on where Murdoch was in America, even in the end of the first decade of this century and in the beginning of the second decade of the century. Even Fox in the old days used to run under the banner fair and balanced news. And then they got rid of that sometime about the dawn of the Trump period. So therefore, you can see the evolution in this. It reflects the deeply far-right conservative views of both Murdochs themselves, whose ultimate worldview is we want tax minimisation for ourselves. We want regulatory minimisation for ourselves. And therefore, we want as small a government as possible in order for there to be a shrinking tax impost on wealthy individuals and on the business community. Their agenda is as basic as that, together with being anti-science and anti-evidence on climate, as well as supporting a particular view on the future of migration in this country as well.
Do you agree with those who have assessed that Trump has turned on Fox in the United States and gone for outlets like Newsmax and One American News, with the exception of several Fox hosts?
Well, the problem with Frankenstein is when you create a monster, sometimes the monster starts to get out of control. And so Frankenstein, in this case Murdoch, helped create helped create Trump. And therefore, when Trump gets out of control, as he plainly did, aided and abetted by the Murdoch beast, leading up to the events of not just the election, Trump's contesting the legitimacy of the outcome of the election, and the armed insurrection of the 6th of January. The bottom line is it becomes a very big, shall we say, out of control political movement, which this guy has unleashed. So therefore, by the time Trump gets to the end of the day and gets to turn around and realize that even his most violent forms of extremism no longer are going to entertain the full support of the Murdoch media beast, then obviously Trump's going to push the agenda further to the right and find even further far-right media platforms that will more fully accommodate him. That's the problem with Murdoch. By creating these far-right beasts who can survive in the absence of fact, evidence, opinion, science, and turn all the politics in simply my opinion's better than yours, irrespective of the evidence, you create this kaleidoscope of possibilities out to the far right. And that is, for example, what Darren Chester in this country, just retiring from the party room of the National Party, is objecting to in terms of the impact of this phenomenon on his own branch and on his own party.
Look, just finally, you were the last person in the Labor Party to be the Prime Minister as it stands right now. I'd just love to know your thoughts. Is Albanese the right man to lead Labor to an election, and could Murdoch stand in his way?
Well, Murdoch will try and destroy Albo like he's tried to destroy each and every one of us who have led the Labor Party. That's what Murdoch does. Murdoch's attack on Hawke when he was in office, clear. His attack on Keating when he was in office, clear. His attack on other leaders, including myself and including Julia Gillard, clear. His attack on Shorten, clear. When were any of these political leaders of the Labor Party ever left alone to simply argue a policy position going into an election, as opposed to having to endure a rolling series of character assassinations? But when, by contrast, did you see the Murdoch media holding Howard to account personally, his character, holding people like Abbott to account for his character, or for that matter, Morrison today? Bottom line is, so Albanese needs to gird his loins and get ready for incoming attacks, because that's the way this beast operates. Is Albo the right person for the time? Of course he is, because he's got one outstanding virtue above all other in dealing with Morrison. And that is in the case of Anthony Albanese. He's the genuine article. He is a guy who says what he believes. He is not Scotty from marketing, who will say what he wants you to believe. And because of Albo's own personal story, growing up in a housing commission in Sydney, his lifelong passion for the Rabbitohs, the fact he doesn't chop and change, and he stands up for the interests of the country, as opposed to simply reading the next round of political market research, it is this clear contrast between a genuine believer in a core set of values on the one hand versus a guy who constantly is looking at the next round of market research to fine-tune his message for the political constituency, which is what we've got in Morrison. Therefore, on that scale, Morrison has a serious challenge on his hands with Anthony Albanese, and I think Albanese can get there.
We'll leave it there. Kevin Rudd, thanks for your time and for joining us here on 6 News.
Good to be with you and everyone who watches 6 News.
And there we go. That was former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd speaking to me earlier from the newsroom on the very first edition of Uncensored. Again, as you saw there was no editing, no cuts. We just showed what he had to say and we asked the tough questions. Of course, we also want to hear from you. So let us know your thoughts on what Kevin Rudd had to say and our program by using hashtag 6newsau in the comments or on social media. Or again, email your feedback to us as well. Contact at 6newsau.com. You can also let us know who you want to see us interview here on Uncensored next time, and subscribe to us with full notifications here on YouTube for plenty more great unbiased news content. I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Thanks for your company. I'll see you next time. Good night.